Welcome to Post Whatever with Ken Nishikawa. Geisha are Islamic State of Japan's enigmatic cultural missiles. Well, as I've said many times in this silly little program, my mother is a geisha. She stopped performing in 2020 due to COVID and a few other things, but she's still a chairman of the Geisha Guild, so she still has teeth, both metaphorically and physically. In fact, all of them intact. Which is more than can be said for most chairmen of most guilds, metaphorically speaking. So, I know a thing or two about the subject. Of geisha, not of dentistry. So today, I will try to the best of my ability to debunk the mysteries and misunderstandings of geisha. I made a documentary film called Matsuchiyo, Life of a Geisha, back in 2018. And the film is basically about my mother, whose geisha moniker is Matsuchiyo. When my film was screened at the Raindance Film Festival in London back in 2018, each screening was followed by a Q&A. Even though I thought I'd made it perfectly clear in the film that the geishas are not prostitutes, there was always someone in the audience who asked whether a geisha was, in actual fact, also the oldest profession in human history. I had to deny it and explain repeatedly. That being said, curiously enough, it is also true that geisha derived from high-class prostitution. This may sound a bit confusing, so let me explain. What needs to be clarified first is that the tradition of high-end prostitution in Japan was very, very different from the Western concept of prostitution in general. Back in the good old days, let's say the Edo era, so that's from 1603 until 1868, when you went to an exclusive brothel to procure the top prostitute, which was never straightforward. You weren't allowed to even touch her at the first meeting. You had to go back a few times and be sort of like a semi-regular. In the meantime, what you do was drink sake, have a conversation about art and culture, and be entertained by her performance, which might be dancing, singing, or playing the shamisen, a three-string instrument that resembles a banjo. First, you had to establish a personal connection with her. And if she decided you were a fine gentleman, you might be permitted to get a bit physical with her. And regardless of the amount of money you were willing to cough up, she could always say no, which frankly is a stricter vetting process than most dating apps currently offer. These top prostitutes were called oiran in Tokyo or tayu in Kyoto. They were like the present-day celebrity, fashion model, and performer all rolled into one. So, effectively, you were paying for a high-class, sophisticated, artistic mistress, rather than a sexy prostitute just to bonk. These women were expected to be not only beautiful, but also elegant, intelligent, and artistically gifted. They studied dancing, singing, shamisen, and table manners and all sorts of manners, as well as tea ceremony, flower arrangement, and so forth. In other words, highly educated. The training took years. And, as far as I know, that's not the way most Western escort ladies are trained. That being said, I could very well be wrong, since I have not, for the avoidance of doubt, conducted a comparative study. Over time, the prostitution aspect of it, which had always been a relatively minor part of the whole business anyway, was slowly discarded. These ladies would only entertain men, and also women, mind you. My mother claims some of her greatest patrons were women. Anyhow, they became divine entertainers who performed dance routines like goddesses, sit next to you, pour sake for you, drink with you, and listen to what you've got to say, like an ideal companion. Thus, geisha was born. The whole transformation would have occurred roughly in the mid to late 18th century to distinguish themselves from high-class prostitutes, whereas oiran or tayu tied their obi, the traditional white sash around the kimono, at the front so the customer could untie and undress them easily. Geisha tie their obi at the back to symbolize that they are there to sell their art, not sex. It is, if you think about it, the most elegant look but don't touch sign in the history of retail. My mother, when she goes to work, wears mesmerizing kimono and ornaments that typically cost over 10 million yen in total from head to toe. In other words, she is a living work of art, or if you like, a walking museum piece. One that, unlike most museum pieces, can also tell you exactly what she thinks of your table manners. My mum was certainly strict about table manners when I was growing up, and despite her effort, my table manners, especially the way I use chopsticks, are still to this day pretty appalling. I certainly did not inherit that part of her genes. Well, then again, I speak marginally better English than her, so no one is perfect. These geisha would perform and be the most wonderful companion for you. She's a woman beyond girlfriend, wife, or mother. To sum up, let me quote a line from a 1956 film, The Tea House of the August Moon. In the film, an American officer assumes geisha are prostitutes. An Okinawan local named Sakini, played by Marlon Brando, says no. The officer asks, well, what do they get paid for then? To which Sakini answers, poor man like to feel rich. Rich man like to feel wise. Sad man like to feel happy. So all go to geisha house and tell trouble. She listens very politely. Pretty soon troubles go away. Perfect. I have nothing more to add, except that Marlon Brando did considerably better speech with a more convincing Okinawan accent than I did. But anyway, this film has become somewhat controversial of late due to cultural appropriation issues, as one can easily imagine. Marlon Brando for a kickoff, a white American guy playing an Okinawan with special makeup and heavy accent doesn't exactly fly in the face of today's political correctness. Well, I can see that. But then again, I still love the film and would recommend people to see it. To me, the film is more about taking the piss out of the American occupation force and rigid Western cultures, rather than out of Okinawan people or tradition. And I would even go so far as to say Brando's performance was superb. He spent time immersed in Okinawa's local community to pick up the accent and mannerisms. He has quite a few lines in Japanese in this film, and the accent is genuinely quite convincing. His special makeup, however, leaves a little to be desired. I'd say it was marginally better than Sean Connery's in You Only Live Twice, the 007 film set in Japan. But that's really not saying much. Connery in that film achieves a look best described as a Scotsman who had recently been informed he is now Japanese. But all in all, I think it's a beautiful film. Seriously. And as a Japanese person whose favourite part of the country is Okinawa, I am not in the slightest offended. As always, the toxin is in the context. I digress. Geisha is a living work of art, a woman beyond girlfriend, wife, or mother, a proud tradition of Japan. And like all beautiful creatures, geisha are also an endangered species these days. There used to be a geisha scene in every community across the country, from Hokkaido to Okinawa. Today, the number of geisha is less than 1% of what it once was. Take Atami, my hometown, where my mum works as a geisha, for example. According to my mother, the geisha scene peaked around 1960, or thereabout, right in the middle of what was called Japan's post-war economic miracle. Back then, there were over 1,000 active geisha in Atami alone. At one point, they ran out of geisha names, so one young geisha was christened Shinkansen. I kid you not. Presumably, she was known for arriving punctually and being extremely fast at whatever. When I began making the documentary back in 2011, right after the earthquake, the tsunami and the nuclear disaster, there were about 200 registered geisha in Atami. In truth, the active geisha were probably closer to 100 even then. Today, in 2026, There were officially about 60 registered geisha left at the Atami Geisha Guild, so that's down to less than a third of what it was 15 years ago. That number includes people like my mother who is no longer performing, so the real number of active geisha is probably half that. And yet, as a guild, Atami is still the biggest in the country, although in terms of total geisha numbers, Kyoto remains the biggest with 200 to 250 active geisha present. Even that figure is about 1/10 of what it used to be. And Kyoto is one area where we all assume that geisha culture is still vibrant. The first major blow to the geisha world wasn't just a lack of interest, but a shift in how corporate Japan does business. Historically, the ozashiki, the geisha banquet, was the venue for high-stakes businesses. Decisions involving millions of yen, or in mainstream politics even, were sealed over traditional games, sake, and shamisen music in the presence of geisha. But two major shifts broke this circle. First, the bursting of Japan's economic bubble in the early 1990s, followed by decades of economic stagnation. Companies could no longer justify spending millions of yen a night on a single banquet. Plus, the government's decision to lower corporate tax and raise consumption tax to compensate. In other words, basically, take less money from the rich and more money from the poor. Geisha banquets used to be claimed as business expenses. Once big corporations no longer had to pay high tax, they no longer had the same incentive to spend on geisha banquets. So this trickle-down theory, that's the biggest bullshit in the history of mankind. Second, strict modern corporate compliance. In the 21st century in which we all live, transparency is king. Lavish, opaque entertainment expenses, especially at exclusive unticketed tea houses and exclusive inns or ryoteis, became a compliance nightmare. Executives traded the traditional ryotei for Western-style luxury hotels, golf courses, or high-end bars in Ginza, leaving geisha without their core clientele. Then there's the issue of exclusivity and pricing. The fee to hire a geisha is never clearly itemized, and it's always pretty dear. And despite the popular claim that there's no tipping culture in Japan, in the world of geisha, there absolutely is, and one is expected to tip generously in a strict traditional style. Most Japanese young people are intimidated by the sheer complexity of it. Also, geishas are known for being a very generous tipper. My mother, for example, she always tips when she takes a cab or goes to the restaurants or cafes. She always pays a little extra. So when people say, oh, no one ever tips in Japan, there are exceptions. Beyond economics, the geisha community is battling severe internal structure problems. The very thing that makes the geisha world beautiful, its rigid adherence to centuries-old tradition, is also what's making it unsustainable for the modern workforce. Recruitment used to start at age 15, right after junior high school. These girls usually came from underprivileged families, often in debts. One of the reasons my mother became a geisha in the first place was precisely that, to pay off family debts. In modern society, high school and even university education are now seen as mandatory. And while poverty certainly exists in today's Japan, it's not comparable to the poverty of the post-war era. Plus, today's children are not expected to self-sacrifice to that extent, whereas before, that was kind of what was pretty much expected of all children in Japan. At the height of her career, my mother was earning, by her account, a tad bit more than the top sumo wrestler's salary. I guess that excludes the endorsement money the wrestlers earn on top. Still, tidy sum by any measure. There's no equivalent economic incentive in the geisha business today. In fact, many young geisha need part-time jobs to make ends meet. So, today's young women become geisha mostly out of curiosity and/or interest in traditional beauty, which is, in many ways, a nobler reason than economic necessity. But it severely limits recruitment numbers. Then there's the Japanese government. It spends billions of yen annually to protect ancient temples, traditional Noh theatres and kabuki actors, and many other traditional art and culture. Yet, the very women who serve as the primary living protectors of Japan's traditional performing arts, the geisha, receive almost zero direct financial support from central or local governments. As the number of active geisha plummets, the critical question emerges. Why has the Japanese government left one of its most iconic living traditions to fend entirely for itself? Why? There are reasons, none of which I find acceptable. In the eyes of Japanese law, geisha districts or hanamachi do not fall under the category of pure art, museums, or theatres. Instead, they're legally classified under the law regulating adult entertainment businesses, known in Japan as hueiho. Because geisha hosts private banquets where alcohol is served and intimate conversation is part of the hospitality, the law groups them into the same broad legal category as modern bars, nightlife lounges, or clubs if you like. A shamisen recital filed under the same paperwork as the hostess bar and karaoke. Bureaucracy has never had much of an ear for nuance or appreciation for art. For a government bureaucracy, using taxpayers' money to subsidize a category of business legally adjacent to nightlife is a political non-starter. This kind of outdated historical biases and strict refusal to separate the art of the geisha from the business of entertainment means that while a kabuki actor receives national funding, a geisha performing the exact same traditional dance does not. For decades, geisha was a self-sustaining luxury industry, quite a lucrative one, according to my mother. But those days are gone. Today, it is barely a profitable business. It is an endangered art form struggling against the clock. And there's not much time left. If the government and Japanese society at large continue to view geisha through the narrow lens of adult nightlife rather than intangible cultural heritage, we risk losing the very women currently struggling to keep these irreplaceable arts alive. And I mean irreplaceable. Once it's gone forever. You can revive it, but I'm pretty sure that won't exactly be the same. Tradition can only feed itself for so long. On that note, this has been Post Whatever. If you found any of that remotely useful, which I seriously doubt, or at least mildly diverting, which is a very, very distant possibility, do consider liking and subscribing. It really does help, so please just click subscribe and you're doing me a massive favor. I'm Ken Nishikawa. Until next time, remember 3 things. 1. Geisha are not prostitutes. 2. One never tips in Japan is not necessarily true. And 3. Japan is not an Islamic state.